Wonderful. Well, I'm Bob. I have written a biography of Noam as well as another book immediately subsequent to that one called The Chomsky Effect. And it's a book that really speaks to this type of a group of people who have been inspired by or who admire Chomsky. And to me, it was very gratifying to write about a person who was so, from my perspective, amazing, but also for so many people, inspiring. And my first contact with Noam was when I was a student, and I'll tell the story a little bit and then come into the question of immigration, which is one of the things that I'll focus upon tonight. But I encountered his work as a student because I got a job as a young person typing convention refugee hearings in Montreal. A convention refugee hearing is that process that you go through when you enter a country other than your own and you claim to have been persecuted according to one of the 5 legitimate categories according to this convention. The convention talks about persecution on the basis of race and religion and ethnic background and political affiliations and religious beliefs. So you have to fit your, as it were, your narrative, the story of your persecution in your country, into the 51 Convention. The 51 Convention was signed by virtually every country in the world. It came in the wake of the Holocaust and in the wake of the 1948 Declaration of Rights. So it is, in a sense, a tool for oppressed people. It's a tool that can be used when your government, when your own government will not allow you some kind of recourse from persecution. It is designed, of course, for people who have not committed criminal infractions, but rather infractions which would not be considered illegal in other countries. So if you happen to be on the wrong side of a racial war, or if you happen to be part of a religious minority that's mistreated, it's those types of people who tend to claim, it's called refugee status, convention refugee status. Does that make sense? So if somebody was fleeing persecution in Sudan, theoretically they could go to any country in the world and claim refugee status. And they would have the international legal right to do so on the basis of this 1951 convention. It's very interesting, however, that this convention was specifically designed to repatriate people subsequent to the Second World War. So the convention was written in a way that's, one of the preambles in the convention says, if you have been persecuted, and if you are outside of your country of origin, on account of events that occurred prior to 1951. That was a very important phrase. So obviously, the reason why this convention was written was not for the refugees of the world, it was for Europe. But there was a lot of pressure from international agencies, governments, people like yourselves, to say, we should open this up. We should eliminate that one clause. And by eliminating that clause, that means that if you're persecuted in Pakistan, or if you're persecuted in Syria, or if you're persecuted in Israel, you can claim refugee status. So there is something called the Protocol that was signed in 1967. And that protocol did really that. All it did was it lifted those words from the convention. And from 67 on, it became possible to claim refugee status in any country of the world, at least theoretically. And it's a very, very important moment for the West because it really marked the beginning of large inflows of people from south to north. Typically, a lot of the immigration had occurred from, say, Europe to the States, or from Europe to Australia. So it had been largely a hemispheric movement. And now for the first time, it was, not for the first time, but certainly for the first time in terms of international law, it was permissible to go from south to north. And you'll notice I'm Canadian. In Toronto, people always talk now about Toronto as being the greatest multicultural city, most multicultural city in the world. Well, I can tell you from experience that until 1967, it was not a very multicultural world. It really was in the face of the convention that there was much more movement from south to north. And the advantage of coming in as a convention refugee, unlike, say, coming in as an undocumented immigrant, is that you fall immediately under the auspices of international law. So the moment you walk out of your airplane and you step foot in a host country, I'll call it a host country, whatever it is, you can walk up to a uniformed officer and say, I am a convention refugee. And the moment you utter those words, you enter into a different legal space. You are under the protection now of the host country. It is a totally legal and legitimate act to commit. At that point, they take away your passport, generally, if you have one. A lot of people, when I was working in this area, did not have them. They would have them forged or bought, and then they would eat them on the airplane because they were so afraid of having a forged passport. They would take away your passport, and then they ask you some questions. Where are you from? What happened to you? And so forth and so on. And then there's a period at which you prepare your convention refugee hearing, your formal hearing. And at the end of that hearing, the officers decide, yes, you can stay in Canada forever as a convention refugee. We will give you citizenship. Or no. But then there's something called non-refoulement. Non-refoulement has never been translated into English for some reason. I think that there's just not a clear term for it. It means you cannot be sent back to your country if doing so threatens your life. So it's a way of moving people out of dangerous situations legitimately and using international law. The way that I encountered this was completely by accident. I was writing my thesis on geomorphology and Lord Byron, which is, if you want to talk about that, is a superb and very wonderful subject, and catastrophism and all sorts of other wonderful things that, of course, everything that Byron did has a sublime and wonderful side. And I was desperate because I was not able to pay my rent. And I was a very gifted typist, which, by the way, Noam is apparently a he's very famous for being a really gifted typist. It's something that I've not asked him about, but. And so I went to a shopping center where they're apparently hiring typists. And inside of this shopping center, there are all of these people who had come here to interview or to work at this job. They didn't even ask me my name. They sat me down. I'd never used a computer before. Put me in front of a computer, put the transcription machine at my feet, and said, just type every word you hear. That's the job. And I did this for about 2 weeks. They did not know my name, and they had not at that point paid me. And it turned out that they were Canada was privatizing the transcription business. They had never done that before. It had always been done internally in the immigration department. But now they were privatizing it to save money and also to get through a 40,000 person backlog of refugees. The people who were running the company, this private company, decided to save some money. So they got rid of the office, and they sent all of us home. And they said, buy yourself a computer, and we'll pay you by the page to work on this. And then they won the contract. So now I was in my apartment. I brought 2 other people who I had met at this place into my apartment. And we had kind of a full-time transcription business going on inside of my apartment, 24 hours a day. We'd sleep and work, and you got paid by the page. The pages, so here's my suffering. I was tortured and violated and so forth and so on, yeah? And I described that torture. This is what I was turned into. Because my description was typed, printed, and then sent to Ottawa. And in Ottawa, Preston, the judge, would read through it, and at the end of it, say, okay, that's a refugee. Or no, that's not a refugee. And it was more or less a final decision that could not be changed. So from a theoretical perspective, a human being was turned into this. Okay. I thought much more about that subsequently, because my first interest was paying the rent, My second interest was, and this becomes interesting in terms of Chomsky, my second interest was, what is it like to work in a job where you spend your entire day listening to people who have been tortured tell their story? Now, as you can imagine, the way that we decide whether or not a story is true is with detail. So I won't get into one, say, about rape, because it's horrendous to listen to those. Let's say somebody who is severely beaten regularly. In the hearings, they would say, how were you beaten? I was stripped naked, I was injected with motor oil into my joints, and then forced to walk across glass. And then they would say, and you'd think, okay, that's it. Okay, you're in. No. Please take off your shoes and your socks. I am now looking at his feet. They bear marks, and then they would measure the marks on the feet. I have a doctor's note about the joint. It is the doctor finds that it's consistent with the story that motor oil was injected into my knees, and that's why I can't walk. So the detail, and again, you can imagine sexual torture, how horrible the detail is. And the questions would be like, when you were beaten, was the guy wearing gloves? Yes. What color? Or when you were beaten, how long were you beaten for? I don't know. Please answer the question. How long were you beaten for? I don't know. It felt like days. Was it days? Was it I need an answer here. You see what I'm saying? Because in our culture, we privilege detail as evidence for truth. But of course, anybody who's been repeatedly raped or tortured, the last thing you can come up with is truth. And if you're interested in this, you can either read every international law book that's ever been written about this stuff, or you can watch one film, which is Death and the Maiden. The Polanski film called Death and the Maiden. If you have a chance, it's a really amazing, amazing story about a woman in Latin America who was arrested because her boyfriend was involved in resisting the power elite, and as a consequence was brought into jail, blindfolded, and repeatedly raped. What she remembered about this, of course, was the senses that were active were smell and sound. And by coincidence, a guy comes into the house whose car is broken down, and she hears the guy, and she thinks it's him. She thinks that's... So after having been released from the jail, she's in her house, and now she thinks that she's just heard the guy who raped her repeatedly. And the story really turns on the question of, is this him? What is the evidence that it's him? What does she actually remember? And what she says to him is, I need my body back. I can no longer enjoy sex. I need my body back. So I need you to confess. Give me back my life. Confess. And you think, is she just in need of somebody just saying, I did it, I'm sorry, or did he actually do it? You see what I'm saying? It's very, very complicated business. So I did this for months, a couple of months. And one of the things that was unbelievably astonishing to me was I would spend my days doing this, and then I would get up at lunch and go out, we'd sit on the trash bins in the back of this horrible building that we worked in, and there were all these people who were working with me, and I would turn to them and say, what case are you working on? I have no clue. Well, what's it about? I don't really listen. You're typing people's stories, but you're not listening? So there is a way, and I still find this astonishing, as a professional typist, to just hear the words, but just as words, not really understand what is being... And there are a lot of people who were like that. So that was one thing that was going on, which was, I think, at this moment, your mind begins to ask a lot of questions. What does this mean? The second thing that was going on was the government was actively saying 99% of convention refugees are bogus. Those are the words used by the Minister of Immigration. And I knew, as much as you can know anything from hearing these things, that what these people were describing could not possibly be false. It just didn't jibe. So after working on these for a long time, after hearing a lot of them, I wrote a manifesto describing my experience with this. The other thing that I wrote about was the Cavalier way in which these stories were treated. All this company wanted to do, and this is maybe a privatization story, all this company wanted to do was win the contract. The suffering of these people, the lives that they had lived, the sorrow that they had suffered and so forth was irrelevant to them. So they used to, this was in Quebec, they would leave the tapes outside of my apartment building on the ground at about 3 o'clock in the morning, go downstairs, pick them up, and I would leave the papers, the transcribed tapes, on the ground, and they would pick them up and take them away. But you can imagine, if you're a political, if you've been persecuted on account of political actions, you might have a warehouse full of guns. You might be on the wrong side, and the detail that was asked for, everybody of course assumed it was very confidential. The detail that was asked for was, where are the guns? They're in a warehouse. Where's the warehouse? I need the address. So we had information that was mind-boggling about things that were going on in the world. So I wrote this thing and I gave it to the CBC, which is not as good as community radio, but it's the best we can do in Canada. And it became an international news story because there was so little protection around these things, because the privatization practice was, I think, really catastrophic. But also because I was questioning the government's claim that these things were, that they were all bogus. And I think with strong evidence to the contrary. Anyway, I landed up, it became it became a bit of a mess, as you can imagine, and they started following me around and eventually arrested me. And while I was doing this, I needed to talk to somebody. Who do you talk to about this? And of course, therefore, this mythical human being named Noam Chomsky seemed to be the right person to write to about this stuff. So I wrote to him, and it was a tremendous, for me, learning experience, empowering experience, to be able to talk about him with him, because ultimately, I realized that the whole border business is very problematic, and this was something that he had talked about in some of his writings. So that was one way in which I became interested in him. Another way was that I was I was studying language. So when I was eventually not charged, I shifted my PhD and I wrote about this process instead. I called it constructing a productive other. And the idea of constructing a productive other is honestly what I'm doing right now. I'm convincing you that I'm worth a little bit of time on a Thursday night in Denver when you could be having one of the local beers. So I'm constructing myself and telling you what happened. So in a sense, I'm kind of turning myself inside out. Yeah, I'm revealing what's inside. That's kind of the process I'm going through, and they go through it in a very dramatic way, because to the degree that they're believed, they will get citizenship. If they're not believed, they get sent home. Right. So it's there's a gigantic amount of investment in this. So I wrote this thesis called Constructing a Productive Other that turned into my first book. And I realized that there was a strong literary side to this. Because I don't know if any of you have written short stories or novels, but you need to create characters who make sense. And that's a tough job. It's remarkably difficult to create characters. In the same way that when you get pulled over by the police and you're speeding, you've got to construct yourself as a person who doesn't normally speed. You say, officer, I can't believe it. Some rocks got in my boots, and whatever it is that you say. But you construct, and you say, I've never been caught before. This is unbelievable, and whatever. You construct yourself as an innocent, law-abiding person, and there are all sorts of ways in which that's very difficult. But that's the process. Does that make sense? So that was interesting from a language perspective. And then there's another perspective, which is, can you, now that I've got these documents, and I'm the judge, can I read through this and decide, yep, this person's lying, obviously, and this person is not? Is there any language theory that would allow you to do that? Can we use any theory of language? So in this book, I tested each major theory of language to see, can we actually find a way to do this in theory? And the answer that I came up with was no. And the other answer I came up with was not we should improve the system, which is what a lot of lawyers say, but we need to get rid of borders. It's completely illegitimate that we are deciding the fates of people who are moving for various reasons, some of them personal, some of them labor, some of them whatever else, and that we're adjudicating these borders and imposing upon them the violence of the state. And that was where I really learned a lot from Chomsky, because he was one of the only persons with whom I could talk about this idea of open borders. So I landed up writing about this, and then we're lucky. We are lucky. We live in great countries. I was hired by the immigration department and became a convention refugee expert and was paid by the Canadian government after having risked 25 years in jail for having been a whistleblower in some ways. All of a sudden I became a legitimate employee, and now and I wrote a couple of books on this about this process. So it's very interesting, and we're very lucky in this way that we can be here together tonight and then not walk out the door and be arrested. I hope. We'll find out. Yeah, we'll find out. So that's how I encountered Chomsky in the first place, and then and my interest in immigration has continued ever since. So I'm sorry for the long answer to a short question.
Excellent, very interesting, and thank you for your great work. I mean, a scholar, activist as well. My own first encounter with Chomsky is kind of related to this. I was living in North Carolina and doing landscaping work, and I ended up living in a household, and one of the women I was living with married a man from El Salvador, and he had been in El Salvador's government military, and he was involved with all sorts of atrocities against peasant organizers and burning down villages and torturing people. He ended up being wounded himself and smuggled out of the country. And this woman I knew married him so that he would not be sent back to El Salvador, because he would have been probably killed for deserting the army. But at the time, I was about 19, 20 years old, and I was hearing these stories from this guy, and hearing the Reagan administration talking about what a wonderful government El Salvador had running, and why we were sending them arms and stuff like that to fight what were labeled communists. And I was just kind of trying to figure out why the media wasn't talking about these wars going on in Central America. And I went back to school. I went back to Fort Collins to go to Colorado State University. And I saw a flyer on a pillar that said something about a guy named Noam Chomsky speaking on Latin America. And I went to that lecture, and really he helped me begin to understand some of these things that were going on. A lot of devastating material, for sure. One of his first books that I turned to was Turning the Tide. And the human rights reports contain in there difficult stuff, but in understanding these stories better, it certainly opened some potential for compassion and sympathy, and understanding my connections to those people out there in other lands. In fact, I was working at a Mexican restaurant, the Rio Grande, and a lot of the people I worked with were from places like Guatemala and Honduras. And again, I kind of had a better feel where they were coming from, what their story was, because of reading Chomsky and then being able to speak with them. And speaking of borders being in nation states being imposed on people, Chomsky wrote a book, actually collaborated on a book called New World or New Worlds of Indigenous Resistance. And there he and indigenous scholars talk about the formation of nation states and how that it's so diametrically opposed to the diversity and multiculturalism and the multi-language world that the Mayans were living in Guatemala. And so if you could speak more to how the nation-state system kind of demands a monoculture, or encourages it in many ways, and what's being lost there.
Well, one of the really interesting things about reading Chomsky is to read the references that he makes in his books So first of all, he talks exactly as Preston is describing here. He is at the kind of center of a gigantic nexus of people who write to him and tell him what's going on and so forth. He meets people like yourselves, and so he has a lot of information. But when he's asked, so what are you? So what are you? Are you a communist? Are you a Democrat? Are you a liberal? What are you? And he'll say, the answer to the question that I've always heard him give is, I'm an anarchist. But if that doesn't sit well with you, if you're not really sure what that means, I'm an 18th century conservative. And then you always get the, what? And that type of, what? Is really, I think, inspiring. And it's inspired me to look back and say, who are you talking about? Which 18th century conservative writer, first of all, are you making reference to? And how does it relate to anarchism? And what is anarchism? I mean, as far as, most people hear of anarchism as just being chaos. There's anarchism in the streets, or, it's an anarchy here today. We've got the strawberries are on sale, but in fact, when you read certain types of books, let's say we'll take one example that he makes reference to that I read. One of the things that's so fun about Chomsky is kind of just following his leads. So he says, you should read this guy named Wilhelm von Humboldt. And, okay, that sounds like a great idea. And as a young man, I think he was 19 in the 18th century, wrote this book called The Limits of State Action. And the limits of state action says that the state need only be involved in the basic business of protecting its people and encouraging a diverse and free environment, subject to a small series of what he called natural laws. So you don't murder, you don't rape, you don't pillage, you don't steal, and so forth and so on. But beyond that, the state steps back.
Libertarian.
Excuse me?
He's a libertarian.
He is in many ways a libertarian, although in this country that's become a tough one, because libertarianism and that type of limited state action, libertarian has become wrapped up in other kinds of causes, as you know, in this country. But yes, in a sense, according to a more historical sense, it is indeed libertarianism. The state should have a relatively small role. But maybe the better description is the state should not impose arbitrary authority. Authority is okay. Red lights are okay. Taxes are okay. Protecting the people is okay. Providing them with free health care, that's okay. But arbitrary authority, you don't get served if you're black. You're not allowed to work here if you're a woman, and so that's arbitrary authority. So, and again, it's following up on leads like that where you think, and then of course questions like borders become very interesting. Because we take it for granted that we need to stop at the border and lose all of our rights for a few minutes while they search us. It was, of course, not always the case. That historically, the national borders are a relatively recent phenomenon. And this, too, is a good reason to look back at history and say, well, what was it like in Italy in 1430 when it was all nation states? So that when it was all city-states, where each city was its own country. That must have been amazing. So what was that like? Or what was it like living as a Native American in America, where you didn't have sort of geographical boundaries in the same way as we understand them? So as we think about these questions of borders, rather than just saying, well, should we tighten security or lessen security? Should we let a few more in, or should we legitimize them? Should we give them green cards? Or a more radical approach, radical as in getting deeper, a more radical approach is to say, well, let's step back and say, well, do we really need the borders at all? And this led to me, to a second major project that I did called Arguing and Justifying. I became interested in the question of why people flee their countries in the first place. And what I realized after having written this book was it wasn't actually about countries, it was about crappy relationships. At what point, when you're in a crappy relationship, you get up and say, you know what, I may have loved you once, but I don't love you anymore. And maybe you're talking to your country, and maybe you're talking to your girlfriend, and maybe you're talking to your husband, whoever you're talking to. It's the moment when you stand up and you say, we've been doing this for a while, it ain't working out, goodbye. But the thing was, the book was about convention refugees. So I was interviewing people about that moment. What was the moment? And I know that not all of you have only been in perfect relationships, but if you've ever been in an imperfect relationship, at what moment did you say, okay, look, that's it? And as regards convention refugees, you may have been repeatedly raped, you may have been incarcerated multiple times, one horrendous situation, but one day you say, kids, husband, I'm leaving. I'm sorry, I can't take it anymore, I'm leaving. So I interviewed people from Pakistan, the former Soviet Union, Israel, and Peru, and asked them why they claimed convention refugee status in Quebec, and what was the moment déclencheur, the moment that just did it. And then how did they justify that decision subsequently? And again, my conclusion at the end of that book was, we should not have borders. Because one of the interesting things you learn in interviewing people is how attached they are to their countries, how attached they are to their places. Free movement does not mean that everybody gets up and starts moving all over the place. It just doesn't make sense. And this was something that really came out in the interviews. Why would a Peruvian move to Cincinnati? Why would somebody from Cincinnati move to Pakistan? It's likely that people who are going to do that are probably going to do it anyway. They might have wanderlust, they might have a girlfriend, they might have a boyfriend, they might have something. But most people are attached to their communities. You've got a community center, you've got friends, you've been doing this for a while, you have loves, you have children, you're tied to a place. And that's very consistent with the anarchist conception of the world also. In anarchism, one of the big differences between anarchism and Marxism is that anarchism understands a sense of place. Marxism, it eliminates, as you know, private property. When you eliminate private property, you also eliminate people's attachment to their soil. You tear people off of their lands, and you make industrial farms, as Stalin did. So that's a really big difference. And again, why I'm very sympathetic to Noam's description, or Rocker's description, or others' descriptions of anarchism, this sense of place. So again, my conclusion at the end of that book was, we should not have borders. And even if we didn't have borders, people wouldn't get up and go all over the place. If you've been to Europe lately, you'll notice that the streets of France are still filled with French people, and the streets of Germany are still filled with German people, and they are allowed to work in each respective country. But a certain percentage of them do, of course, but it's relatively small. France is still pretty damn French. And they have more or less open borders. So it's a fascinating realization. Okay, we could probably disassemble the border between here and Mexico and Guatemala and Canada tomorrow. And of course you'd have some people come. Of course, people are curious. And by the way, I think my kids would probably go to Guatemala and get a job, at least for a while. It'd be awesome if they could do it legally. And Canadians would certainly, seek out a little bit of warmth, and then when they realize how warm it is, they would go back to Canada. You get attached to stuff. It's just normal. One of the shocking things that I found in this book was I interviewed Israelis who were living in, I was interviewing former Soviet citizens who were living in Israel. And they hated it. They absolutely hated it because it was too goddamn hot and nobody played hockey. So they moved to Quebec. And you say, why'd you move to Quebec? And they say, are you kidding? The Montreal Canadiens are awesome. They go, okay, well, that's why people move. That's a good reason. But what do we hear on the news? Well, if you open up a flood, everybody's going to move to Quebec. Everybody's going to move to Denver. All the, just be inundated. Why? And what are they going to do here? You got to kind of ask that question to yourself. So again, that book led me to thinking about open borders. And again, historically, it's fascinating.
Thank you. Well, speaking of radio, and preserving language, recently, since the most intense part of the war in Guatemala, for instance, has subsided, although there's plenty of repression still going on. But, people like Rigoberta Menchú felt free enough to run for the presidency. And also I read a magazine called Cultural Survival, and Mayan Indians have actually started their own community radio stations in Guatemala. And I heard people in the introductions, like a couple of people mentioned Democracy Now! And again, another place where we're getting that training, we're learning to resist the propaganda that Bertrand Russell was talking about in that quote. And just today on Democracy Now! Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez were talking about the hunger strike going on around the detention centers and the poor treatment that people are receiving there. They're being made to work for $1 a day. You know, this is very much related to labor issues, whether they're arrested by our prison industrial complex or by the growing detention industrial complex. They're often being put to work. You know, these complexes themselves are big rackets, money-making rackets. So, you have to create borders, and you have to create these threats to have the justification to spend billions of dollars along the border so that Boeing and companies like that can further militarize it. It very much is bringing to mind that film, Children of Men. I don't know if any of you have checked that out, but it's kind of a dystopian vision of increased border, so-called security and things like that. And I think a much more optimistic, helpful, and humane approach would be no borders and things like international solidarity and you know, what Thomas Paine talked about, how the world is my country. So thank you for sharing that vision. And in chapter 4 of your book, The Chomsky Effect, you were talking about just effect and Chomsky on law and ethics and things along those lines. And I very much, just effects, Chomsky on law, ethics, and human rights. And this kind of reviewing that, it kind of reminded me of what you were saying about him being an 18th century conservative and having respect for the rule of law. And that isn't a contradiction between being an anarchist and having respect for just laws. And that distinction you made between law and authority, again, I appreciate that. Is there anything else you want to, how that can be broken down? Maybe these borders can be.
Sure. Well, one of the names that was mentioned was Rigoberta Menchú, who, as you know, is famous for her active resistance and so forth, but is also famous because there were questions posed about the legitimacy of her narrative. Did you all, you of course heard this. So the claim was that this story that she had told about being a poor Guatemalan Mayan woman was somehow falsified. And you kind of can't help, if you're in groups like this, say to yourself, well, here we go again. You know, somebody stands up for herself and describes the plight of the poor and the oppressed, and we focus upon whether perhaps some of the segments in there may have been exaggerated or may not, or maybe, as some of the claims were made, a compendium of different narratives of different people and not all of them her own. So one of the ways that propaganda works in this society is you discredit somebody and in an effort to put the narrative aside. So when we're, the first thing that they do when Snowden starts releasing this stuff is they look for dirt on Snowden. Did he really go to the NSA to work, or was he there to steal stuff? What is he really like? Is he a communist? And you think, you kind of lost the point here. The point here is that he was saying Americans ought to know what their NSA is doing. And we ought to think about that. And if he happens to be the handmaiden of that knowledge, well, good for him. But no, we let him say, so what do you think about Snowden? What do you think about him? That's irrelevant in many ways. What's important is, what do we think about the fact that we're being tapped in everything that we say? That's the question. Rigoberta Menchú is the same question. This poor Mayan woman tells a story, and they say, well, some of it is exaggerated. Well, this gets back also to the construction of the productive other. If you're telling a story of persecution, you're telling it hoping to achieve certain things. Let's say you're hoping to turn people's gaze towards the oppression against Native American people. Maybe you tell not only your story, but also the story of your neighbor. And since it's your story, you kind of mix them together. That's a good idea, narratively speaking. It's a bad idea if the propaganda machine's going to get turned on, and they say, well, you're a liar, and if we can't believe you on that, then what are we going to believe you on? How much more, and it's it's very clear the way that works. Another good example of this is, oh, you're here on a fake passport? You're on a fake passport, you criminal? and you say, actually, I was being beaten and tortured in prison by the government, it didn't really occur to me to go to their passport office at that time. Well, no, you're a thug. You ate your passport on the airplane? What are you, like a barbarian? No, I'm terrified because I bought that passport from a doctor who said if I got raped one more time, I was going to die. That's why I ate it. Well, you're a criminal. You obviously can't come into this country. We have the same thing right now with the undocumented immigrants. In all of the claims that are being made about how to improve the system, there's always this caveat. If you've committed a crime, you'll never gain status in this country. So what kind of a crime are we talking about here? You know, have we ever committed crimes? And a lot of the crimes are very cultural. It's a very important role that an institution like this serves, is to promote useful knowledge to people who are not accustomed to the ways of this society. A lot of you have been to Mexico or Guatemala. You know that at a party people shoot off guns. You shoot off a gun here, it's a felony. You have a felony and you're also here as an undocumented immigrant, you're looking at 10 years in jail. And then deportation. If you come back, then you'll serve just about your entire life in jail. So you say, we don't do that in this country. It's just not, I know that in your country you do it, we don't do it in this country. That's it, that's something that we can do. But the way that we criminalize and the way that we propagandize against people, and then in doing that, push them aside is incredible. So why is Chomsky important? We keep mentioning his name. He's important because he revolutionized the study of human language. And in so doing, established a department with a friend of his, Morris Halle, of linguistics and philosophy at the greatest, possibly the greatest university in the world, MIT, and made a name for himself in the field of linguistics and revolutionized our understanding of how language works in the human brain. That was his legitimacy. And then as a legitimate person doing that, he can then say, okay, I got a couple of hours. I wonder what's going on in the world, and I wonder what I can do to help. Because I bear with me legitimacy. Another person Bertrand Russell is a great example of this, who advocated the possibility of free love and movement and against propaganda and so forth, and he was persecuted for his beliefs, but he was, Principia Mathematica was a great text of mathematics and logic that gained him a reputation, that gave him a podium, that made him legitimate. Another example of this that very few people know about is Einstein. Einstein, we all know why he got into this country and so forth. Well, the truth of why he got into this country was that he was connected to, here's where some of the bizarre coincidences start, he was connected to Noam Chomsky's teacher because he believed that as a Jew, and as it turned out also a German Jew, he believed in a Palestinian region that would not oppress the peoples who were there, but he was also concerned for the plight of the Jews in the world, and he talked about this and wrote about this. But one of the things that he said was, we cannot have a Jewish state in Palestine, because if we do, we will have war between the Arabs and the Jews for a millennium. It will be a catastrophe. We all love and revere Einstein, apparently, but very few people know that that was his position. And where it becomes very interesting as regards Chomsky was that it was Chomsky's teacher, Zellig Harris, the linguist, who invited Einstein to come and address this little group, a little bit like this one, called a VUCA, because of his views of Palestine and his incredible commitment to the idea of strong and positive relationships between the Arabs and the Jews. As it turns out, as you can imagine, Einstein was followed by the FBI, considered to be a potential enemy of the state. But because of the role that he played in science, he was given this legitimacy that allowed him to speak on other matters. So we have three interesting examples. We have Einstein, and we have Chomsky, and we have Harris. I don't know if you just mentioned his wife.
Yeah.
Bruriah Kaufman.
She did all the work, and he wrote the rest.
I love that.
That's no joke.
Let's talk about his wife for a second. Bruriah, another unbelievably interesting and fascinating story relating to this. Bruriah Kaufman was a Palestinian woman who was Zellig Harris's first cousin. I remind you, Zellig Harris, Noam Chomsky's teacher. Zellig Harris was trying to do for linguistics what Albert Einstein had done for particle physics. So he was drawn very strongly, as many, many people were, to the person of Einstein. Well, as it turns out, Bruriah Kaufman, his first cousin, became Albert Einstein's principal assistant and worked with him on the mathematics. That was her area of specialization. And worked with him in the labs and was very, so Zellig Harris, now, I probably shouldn't say so because I'm about to tell something that sounds like a soap opera here, so I apologize. But he got to know, again, she was already his first cousin, but got to know Bruriah Kaufman, and through Bruriah Kaufman came to be close to somebody who he very much admired, Albert Einstein. He landed up marrying Albert Einstein's principal assistant, Bruriah Kaufman, his first cousin, and was with her until his death. So I'm weaving a wild web here, but it's kind of the story of tonight also, is to say, and this picture I think is very appropriate to this. Noam Chomsky has had an effect, it sounds like, on almost all of you. So I kind of think of the ripples outwards. You know, he speaks and he inspires. He speaks and people admire him and so forth and so on. But he's also at the center of a lot of different relationships. And to understand these relationships, whether they be with Einstein, whether they be with Guatemalan freedom fighters, whether it be with Bertrand Russell,
Rage
or
Against the Machine.
or Rage Against the Machine or Band of Horses, he has all of these amazing connections. And one of the unbelievably exciting things in getting to know his work is to explore where it comes from, how it's connected, what the relations are, how it relates to Bruriah Kaufman and so forth. It's absolutely fantastic and fascinating. It's an enormous amount of reading, but it's all good times.
It is fascinating, and I'm so glad you brought up that topic. This is Noam's teacher that Bob was referencing, Zellig Harris. This is, and the subtitle is From American Linguistics to Socialist Zionism, and it goes more in depth into that story. Bob was just telling about the Zellig Harris, Einstein, Chomsky connection, and allow me to read this review of this book, actually. Zellig Harris's dream of a secular leftist Zionism built on cooperation with the indigenous Arab population has been dashed by history, but his legacy stubbornly survives, not only in the pioneering work he did in the field of linguistics, but also in the inspiration he provided Noam Chomsky, the most outspoken political gadfly of our day. In this rigorously researched, sympathetically cast biography, Robert Barsky rescues from oblivion a figure from the past who may still have much to teach the future. That was from Martin J., University of California, Berkeley, and I thought an apt description. Part of what wanted me to bring Robert to Colorado was an interview that Bob did on a radio program called New Books in Language, where he discussed this topic. And so if you YouTube search Zellig Harris, Robert will come up and he'll go more into that. And I'm glad you brought up that vision of socialist Zionism. For a long time, especially since the most recent invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Islamophobia in this society is just off the charts. And I monitor a lot of right-wing radio and watch some action-adventure movies. There was a film called Obsession, which was an anti-Muslim hit piece. And there were like 30 million free copies of that film distributed in newspapers around the country. And anyway, it helped facilitate our invasions. And people have been working against it also. There's a scholar named Jack Shaheen who wrote a book called Real Bad Arabs, real spelled R-E-E-L, and he talks about how Hollywood vilifies the people. He's been doing phenomenal work. And the organization, the Media Education Foundation, puts out a lot of counter documentaries that expose, the propaganda going on in much of our media, and also in a lot of our so-called entertainment media, which is often more of a militainment or misinfotainment. But in kind of trying to find ways to resist Islamophobia, including engaging some of those talk radio shows, I think maybe more recently I came to the realization of something Noam only mentioned kind of in passing, and that was the amount of anti-Semitism in this country. And I was wondering, because of the situation with Israeli government oppressing the Palestinians, sometimes there are a lot of theories and conspiracy theories and a lot of anti-Jewish, Judeo-phobic rhetoric. And I was wondering, Robert also teaches some Jewish studies at Vanderbilt. He's taught classes on one called Radical Jews, Leonard Cohen and Allen Ginsberg and many others. I was wondering if you could speak to more on this vision of socialist Zionism and also to Judeophobia in this country.
Well, there's a long history, of course, of Judeophobia. I guess one of the things you'd asked about Chomsky's own background. He was born in Philadelphia and raised in Philadelphia to Jewish parents who themselves came from a shtetl in the Pale, as my father did, in the Ukraine. And he talked about the rabid anti-Semitism that was around him, but he also talked a lot about the rabid anti-Irish sentiment in his neighborhood and the rabid anti-Italian sentiment in his neighborhood. There was a very strong, all sorts of contestatory politics, I think, in lower and lower middle class Philadelphia in 1928 when he was born, and subsequently. The question of the relationship between Chomsky's work and Judaism is a very interesting one, I think, and a very complex one. One of the ways in which Chomsky, in some ways, reflects his background is that he was the son of a Jewish scholar, and I think arguably both of his parents were important Jewish scholars, but his father was a Hebrew grammarian and a specialist in the Jewish language, in Hebrew language. And the Hebrew language is the subject of a lot of linguistics work because of, like Sanskrit or Native American languages, it's deemed to have in its history a kind of depth and maybe almost magic that can be perceived. And maybe that's one of the reasons why there are so many Jewish linguists in this country. They were raised on a kind of Talmudic tradition of close readings of a language that was deemed to be perhaps, historically of tremendous importance. But it also turns out that a lot of linguists, so I just said a lot of linguists in this country, Bloomfield, Sapir, Boas, Chomsky, Harris, and the list goes on, are Jews. And I don't think you can say something easily about that, but maybe it has something to do with the fact that they grew up with Hebrew and English, and maybe it has something to do with the fact that a lot of them come from Yiddish-speaking families. I'm not sure. I don't think anybody is. But it also turns out to be the case that a lot of the people who were linguists were also radicals. So again, that same list, Bloomfield, Sapir, Boas, Chomsky, Harris, they all had affiliations with various versions of the left. And there too, we can speculate. Why is that? Why was Karl Marx, why is it significant perhaps that Karl Marx was Jewish? Why is it significant that Noam Chomsky is Jewish? Why is it significant that Zellig Harris is Jewish? Is there something culturally that might make Jews more interested in alternative communities. And maybe one of the things we could say is that they had learned, living in these shtetls in the Ukraine, that they could trust nobody. It wasn't the Tsar who was going to save them from the pogroms, but it also turned out to not be the Marxists who would save them from pogroms. And therefore, maybe, this is something that I tentatively think might be possible to say, maybe it is the case that the Jews learned a kind of resistance to authority and power, because authority and power in history had been very much against the Jews. The Jews had suffered under all sorts of versions, whether it be kings and queens, whether it be emperors, whether it be presidents and prime ministers. They had suffered and maybe had learned that the isms that a lot of people hold on to may not be such a good idea after all. And for those of you who know Noam, he has never jumped onto bandwagons. He never said, well, that's it, Obama's going to save everybody, we can go home. Right? Good thing he didn't do that. He never said, well, Mao was a great figure. Well, Lenin, if only. No, he doesn't do that. He thinks for himself, and he forces us to think for ourselves. And we don't rah and say, go Democrats, just as we don't rah and say, go Maoists. We don't do that. We think for ourselves. Does that lead to a degree of Judeophobia? Does it seem to make people like Noam a little bit less American? Maybe. Maybe if you think for yourself and you're not either Democrat or Republican or Miami Dolphins or whatever, or Dell Computers or Apple, if you're not one of those two things, then maybe you're a bit of a problem. I'm not sure. That might be a possible idea. The other thing in which all of this gets wrapped up in, of course, is the question of Israel. Israel is a complicated one in regards to Chomsky. His family was involved in Jewish cultural affairs and were strong supporters of Palestine and eventually of there are a lot of people in the community hoped that the Jewish state would be established. I should say that a lot of people also didn't hope for that, and they were members of the people who are talked about here. So when Noam, and this again is something very important to know about Noam, when Noam says, I'm going to hold Israel to the same standards as other countries, then he's considered to be anti-Israel. So when he says Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is illegitimate because it involves brutal force and repression and does not allow them to cross their own borders and so forth and so on, what he's doing is he's holding them to the same standard as he holds other people. But the Jewish lobby in America vilifies Chomsky I can't even begin to tell you how much. I am hated. I've had bomb scares in talks because I talk about Chomsky. That's how much, there's guilt by association here. But I also have an interesting experience as regards Israel. I mentioned to you that I had studied Israeli refugees who came from Israel. Now that should immediately go, what? Israel, it's such a great place to live. It's awesome. How can you possibly be a refugee from there? These were people who came from the former Soviet Union to Israel. They spent 4 years in Israel, and then they came to Quebec. And they claimed refugee status not from the former Soviet Union, but from Israel. And what they would say in the hearings was, we were persecuted in the former Soviet Union because we were too Jewish, because maybe we had a grandfather or a grandmother who was Jewish. We were persecuted in Israel in exactly the same ways, but for not being Jewish enough. And it was a horrible place to live. And our wives were treated like prostitutes, and we couldn't get jobs. And it was sickening and horrible. So the Quebec government was accepting them as convention refugees, and I was interviewing them. So I was invited to Israel, and I went to go and talk about convention refugees from Israel living in Quebec. And when I got to my hotel, I was a kid. I was in my late 20s. I got to my hotel, there was an invitation from the Prime Minister's office of Israel. And I went there. I went to the Knesset, and I went into the Prime Minister's office, and there was the head of Sachnut and the Minister of Immigration and all these Prime Minister staff, and they said, read your paper. Read the paper you're going to present. So I read the paper describing what the convention refugees from Israel were saying about what it's like to live in Israel. And everybody in the Prime Minister's office said, well, honestly, it's true. It's true. It's horrible. It's horrible here being a Russian Jew. The weather's awful. They don't get hired. The women are treated like prostitutes in a lot of cases. What you described does not at all surprise us. And thank you for your presentation, by the way. It makes perfect sense. I go back to Quebec. And Quebec is under pressure, like the rest of Canada is under pressure, to quit accepting refugees from Israel. Because how can you accept refugees from Israel? It's a perfect place. So all of Canada shuts down the convention refugee treatment for Israelis, except Quebec. And Quebec says, you know what? Actually, I think we're going to take a look at this. We're going to study it. So you can just imagine the outpouring of hatred towards Quebec. You're a bunch of anti-Semites. You're a bunch of Catholic anti-Semites. You're lying, cheating. And when I would present this stuff, they wouldn't even listen. It was beyond the pale. Sorry for the joke there. I then presented the same thing in New York, and it was difficult to even speak. And above the fray, you say, but in Israel, they said it was true.
Yeah.
The lobby is so exaggerated and crazy in its devotion to heavily militaristic and heavily nationalistic ideas that they are way beyond what happens in Israel. There's so much more contestation in Israel. So the relationship between Chomsky and Israel, which as you know is very contestatory, is because he writes about this stuff and says, I'm holding them to international standards, and by international standards, they're a bunch of militaristic thugs, and it's true. And God help you if you're a Palestinian living in Israel. It is a horrendous situation, and it is appalling. And it's perfectly legitimate, I think, to say so. And I think that when you're in Israel, you can say it. But for some reason, when you're in the States or when you're in Canada, you come up against the Jewish lobby who calls you an anti-Semite if you say that. Well, that's just nonsense. So, again, a long answer to a short question.
No, it's a complicated topic that deserves a long answer. And again, thank you for this forum. I hope we're not running over time.
How's
How
our
are you on
time?
time, Jerry?
Heading for 8:30. I don't know if you want to take a break.
You want to take a break and eat, drink, be merry, stand up, do somersaults?
8:30. Can I make one last remark? I thought on that last comment he made. I think part of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the Jewish lobby would you distinguish between that and the Israeli lobby, because that lobby involves a lot of right-wing Christian Zionists, pastors like John Hagee, and they have this vision, and it's anti-Semitic to the core of the Messiah coming back, if Israel is in turmoil, and so it's a very, let's hope it doesn't become a fulfilling prophecy.
Oh, the complexity.
And but I also appreciate your comment. Well, actually, Paul Cavell wrote a book, something like "Living Under the Cross," about the Christian hegemony of this culture, and how Israel's politics are often kind of out of its hands. It's really being decided by forces here, Christian forces usually. But I appreciated your comment about the bomb threats you had received. You mentioned that around this topic. I was actually working with David Barsamian's Alternative Radio when we aired a program on the Middle East. And at the time, I was receiving all the calls that he was getting for people who were interested in ordering the tapes and the transcripts. And I was receiving so much anger. I mean, a lot of people were appreciative of it, but the people who didn't like that program, I never experienced so much anger over the phone. And there were even people who had been in the Israeli army contacting stations, pressuring them, furious about it. I heard from the head of public relations from Aramco, which was the Saudi oil company, and it was just a very interesting experience, and I got a quick lesson as to why Chomsky has security when he's talking about the Middle East, or has offered it. So again, it's a subject that needs to be discussed, and it's more easily discussed in Israel,
Yes, it is.
ironically enough, in Haaretz and
Yeah, absolutely.
sources like that.
Absolutely.
And again, I appreciate the courage of people who are putting it out there and forcing this discussion. And yeah, so thank you. And thank you for this and for your attention and time and your words. And yeah, let's eat, drink, be merry, get some books. And,
Yeah, should we do questions?
Couple questions.
Okay. Yeah,
For
sure.
comments and questions, and then if we want to purchase any of those things over there, would you tell us how we could do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're going to take like a 5 or 10 minute break, 10 minutes, and then we're going to,
And then we'll have questions?
yeah, and then we'll come back and yes, definitely converse.
Great.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you.